we thought that we would talk about movies. Since I've been on this podcast before, and Ken and I, really the basis of our friendship initially was movies. We bonded over movies. So we thought it might be helpful to talk about specific movies, of course. But before we do that, talk about the place of movies in life in general and maybe a Christian way of looking at movies. I think most of us by default are inclined to look at movies as really recreation and entertainment. It makes perfect sense, and there's nothing wrong with looking at movies as a form of entertainment. But we want to suggest to you that movies can be and often are more than entertainment. In my experience, in Christian communities, we tend to be a little bit more skeptical when it comes to movies as a form of art. Many of us don't really look at them like we do a great work of art. We would say, well, yeah, no, this is entertainment, this is fun, this is recreational. Certainly, this isn't anything along the lines of what you would find in a gallery or something like that. So that's really my first question for you, Ken. You've got an extensive knowledge, first of all, of movies, but also of the history of cinema. And if this is indeed an art form, as I would maintain it is, it's a relative newcomer on the scene.
Yes.
Do you think we should look at movies as a form of art and take them more seriously and do you think that they can be more than mere entertainment? And if so,
Yes.
why?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit of the history there too.
Yes. Okay. That's good. And I recall from Francis Schaeffer's writings. Remember they came out in '68, Escape from Reason, and then The God Who Is There, and then He Is There and He's Not Silent, and then other books that came out. But he came up with this thing called The Line of Despair. And you recall that it started off with philosophy as the first inceptor in kind of the way that in which worldviews were captivated and understood the change. With the philosophers would get it first. Then the second was the musicians, and then it's philosophy, art, music, general culture. That was his sequence. Philosophy. Then he said the artists caught on to the concepts, even though they didn't know it. They knew it in a deeper sense, an intuitive sense. And then the musicians would catch on, and then the general culture, which he would include opera, it would literature, theater, so forth. And then the theologians always the ones to catch on last. But the point is, though, that something has happened, and opera was the ultimate exemplar of all the kinds of forms of art combined together. And in fact, Richard Wagner didn't want to call his work operas, but actually music dramas. And because he saw them as more than just an opera, it was art and architecture, and you had the whole idea of not only music but poetry and performances and all the and just the decor. All these things were woven together. So it was a grand form. My view is that film ultimately replaced the opera as being the mega medium. You see, so that opera, the music dramas of opera were astonishing, and there was nothing quite like it because they did combine drama and all the other components and story and literature and imagery, and even threw in ballets with them very often. But with film, a whole new thing was born. And around 1895, Georges Méliès and the Lumière brothers in France. And so you had these amazing early achievers who came up with things like Méliès, especially new things that had never been seen before. And the trip to the moon was his most famous one, but many of those things have been recently rediscovered. But the point is that it was in its infancy. And so film became a new thing. And so as infants, the first couple decades aren't as interesting in many ways. But by the time it reached its adolescence, especially began to feel its oats in the late 20s, and then in the 30s, it really began to hit a stride. And so you have a new art form then that's beginning to become more mature, and that's developed, and then in the 40s and teasing out new implications, especially with the addition of sound and how that changed the rules of cinema. But I find that cinema is more than just something to be taken lightly, but I think it's a profound culture shaper, influencer, and is really the most powerful art form there currently is, because it combines virtually and adapts from every discipline, every arena, whether digital or analog, and all forms in between. So the possibilities of film are now astonishing. And it's really, then it came into a kind of a decadence in the 50s and 60s, and maybe not as much as new ideas, and more recently, a diminishment in its capacities. In fact, many things in television, this idea of turning television into film and turning it into series that's where the real creative endeavor is taking place now. But it's wonderful to study the history of film and to see how rich a portrait it is of the human condition on every level you can think of.
Well, we'll come back to your comments on decadence, because I think that's really interesting. Your opera thesis is really compelling as well. And it makes a lot of sense on the face of it. And even when you start to move into the sound era, you have, of course, musicals, and you have the incorporation of, music is now a major element of films. But that brings up an interesting question. Here I shall meddle just a little bit, especially with us as evangelicals. It has to do with films, silent films, initially, before you have talkies, so to speak. I think a lot of people now would be inclined to skip all of the silent films, because they're used to, I need dialogue, I need people talking. Why on earth would I do that? It's been my experience, Ken, in evangelical circles, people will use a phrase, and maybe you've used it before as well, and that's fine, but they'll say, well, we need to learn to read movies, to look at their worldview, to take them apart, to dissect them, the phrase I'll use for this is, oh yeah, you want to data mine a movie.
Data mine, yeah.
You want to data mine it, you want to, just excavate everything out of there. But I actually think, unless we carefully nuance what we mean by that, that's a terrible way to watch movies. The first thing you should do is, as C.S. Lewis recommended with a great book, let it wash over you.
Yes.
Allow yourself to actually be ravished by the film. The part of the problem that I find is a lot of evangelicals will miss what's right in front of their faces, because they are trying to do just that. They're trying to read the movie. And film is a visual language.
Yes.
So there is so much packed into the imagery of a film. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about some of the early silent films and what they do with imagery and how that works on the level of meaning for those films.
And the imagination that it entailed as well. And without the use of actual sound, then what could you achieve? And it turned out to be astonishing. And many things, in fact, were lost with the advent of sound in a certain way. But when I think about the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, or the whole thing of Nosferatu, the undead.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. Yep. And so you're talking about silent films. You're talking about Metropolis, Fritz Lang. And then one great film that I recently discovered was La Inhumanity. And so it's like 1924, and this French expressionist from the time of the German expressionists were cutting edge. Films like Wings from 1927 or Sunset 1928. These are fabulous films that need to be seen on their own, and would you realize in many cases would be ruined by the use of sound, because their whole dynamic then implies nuances and suggestions that were then it was a kind of a loss of certain things and a gaining of other things. There was a trade-off that was made, but it was definite in some respects a loss of certain creative potential and capacities for reading the thing. It's almost like the difference between hearing radio, hearing a story on radio and watching that same story on television, where you have the mind's eye now, but they're now guiding us. And so television can kill the imagination rather than enhance it. So there are trade-offs, aren't there, in all these things? But we don't often appreciate the adolescence of film and how the energy that abounded, the creativity that these earlier craftsmen came up with, are almost beyond imagination what they were able to achieve in certain times. So there are certain, I have a lot of favorites of this period. Jean Cocteau, cutting edge kinds of things. Il Sang de Poète, the Blood of a Poet. And I remember it came out in 1929 or something. I remember when my wife and I, Karen and I, introduced me to that film. As she did to so many things, it opened up a whole world because these effects that they did and the magic that it brought to the table. La Belle et la Bête is another one. This imagination where you have everything's alive and everything is preternatural. There's a dynamic that's a story, it's ethos. So they can be captivating and compelling in many ways. These earlier years are really amazing achievements. And new things were opened up that were not available before, new explorations in this medium. So just to see its potential and tease it out. But then, as I say later on, there would be a diminishment, the loss of plots and stories and depth. And so it has its life cycles, doesn't it? An art form. So you think about film and radio as being recent art forms that are now, they begin to lose their initial cutting edge.
And I think going back to, just to illustrate a little bit of that imaginative trade-off that you're talking about there, Ken, you can compare a film like Nosferatu,
yes,
the Murnau, F.W. Murnau one, which I think came out in 1927.
Yeah.
That was what I was thinking. So you can look at that, and you can compare the amazing visual language of that film to a modern sitcom, for instance, where all the work is done for you, so to speak. Every plot item, every joke is telegraphed to you. So is it more immediately accessible and funny? Say an episode of Seinfeld, an episode of Friends, an episode of New Girl, The Office.
Yeah.
Choose your sitcom. Is it more immediately enjoyable? Yes, it's more immediately enjoyable the way a pack of Skittles is immediately enjoyable, I suppose. And maybe a more subtle, French dish might take some refinement in your palate to enjoy. Now that, of course, that runs the risk of sounding kind of snooty, but think about Nosferatu. One of the visual cues in that movie that I find so interesting is that its central villain, the vampire, and by the way, there's a whole very tortured story behind the production of that film. It is Bram Stoker's Dracula, but Bram Stoker's widow would not let them use, it is Dracula, but wouldn't let them use that title, sued them. There was all sorts of turmoil behind the scenes, so they called it Nosferatu. But the villain, which is essentially Dracula, Nosferatu, he looks like a rodent, very animal-like, rat-like.
Sharp teeth.
And animal-like in his movements. And it's so good at communicating that this is a creature that's much more animal, driven by this primal hunger. But if you look at a lot of modern vampire stories, you can take the Twilight series, for instance. You have sparkly vampires that are very glamorous. And in fact, a lot of our newer cinematic depictions of vampires portray them as, highly sexualized, very
Buffy
glamorous.
The Vampire Slayer became an earlier part of that.
Exactly. And so if you look at those two, one a vision of our over-sexualized culture filled with lots and lots of dialogue, everything telegraphed for you, a lot of subtlety removed. I would argue that's getting at a little bit of the diminishment. That's a measurable diminishment that Ken's been talking about right there. You have one that's, now the two that are interesting to put side by side in that aspect, and this was one of Ken's first film assignments for me, was to take the 1927 Nosferatu and then compare it with Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, which came out in 1979. Yeah, which was also, it's a very rich story. It's a little bit more of but right there already, what's interesting there, and this is a separate line of thinking. You start off with the vampire in the 1927 one as clearly a monster, much more animal than human. But by 1979, with a consummate artist, Werner Herzog, it's a much more sympathetic portrayal of the monster. So right there, I don't know if that's necessarily an imaginative diminishment, but it's certainly a change in a shifting mindset. I mean, it's a shifting mindset that you see with a newer film.
Murnau's film actually was 1922. I forgot it was a little bit
So
earlier.
earlier,
Yeah.
goodness.
So Max Schreck was, but you're absolutely right. When I compare that and with Werner Herzog's version of that, which brought us back to the ethos, the mythos, the imagination, the power of evil that's manifested in a richer and more profound way than the typical Dracula idea that was popularized by Hollywood. It's a richer return to something that didn't even exist before. It was an amazing achievement.
So I've got another question for you, Ken. And this one comes courtesy of Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader he's a film writer and a director. He continues to make movies up to this day. He's in his 80s, I believe. Paul Schrader is best known as the writer of Taxi Driver and Raging Bull. He collaborated quite a bit with Martin Scorsese, but he's a good filmmaker in his own right. But he once said, cinema is profane in its guts. And what he means by that is cinema is it's a very seductive art form. And that's what it's designed to do, to pull you in through that. It's going to seduce you visually through its imagery, through its music, through its beautiful actors, all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't always go in that direction. So Ken and I became friends talking about a certain kind of film that is highly spiritual and employs a number of different techniques to undercut some of those what Schrader is calling profane seductive tendencies. And these are films like Tokyo Story. They are films like any of the work of Bresson or Ordet is another film along these lines.
Yeah,
and
Kurosawa. There's just some amazing iconic images that bring us back to another realm of film that's so powerful. Of these great moments of great film, and both in Japanese film, but also I think about the wonderful work of on the European circuit. So you're looking at films by Fellini and Bergman and Godard and others that bring out new things that we hadn't seen before. It's or just rich and profound, compelling stories that are embedded. La Strada by Fellini or Nights of Cabiria and things like that. So these are great films that are often overlooked. But the film that we were talking about was Robert Bresson, and we were talking about he did a film called Mouchette, and he did Le Hazard Belshazzar, and he also did Diary of a Country Priest, as I recall. And amazing work, and the subtlety that instead of EO, which I saw, but it was ruined by the fact that this other donkey beats him, upstages him, because there's a richer portrait in that simple black and white film.
So say the title again, though, for our listeners.
Hazard Belshazzar, and it has to do with the perils of Belshazzar, named after one of the presumed names of the feast of the Magi that it was later traditionally assigned with that.
What's interesting about that is, so Ken, let's get real practical about this. You and I love this film. I watched this film with my wife, and she was really annoyed with me. So part of what Paul Schrader was getting at, and he had a name for this. His famous book about this is called Transcendental Style in Cinema. And he identified just that, a style that cuts across nations, because he looks at some films that are Japanese, he looks at some films that are European. But what they're doing is these filmmakers are trying to make works of art that are profoundly contemplative and spiritual in nature.
That's correct.
And he pointed out how difficult it is to do that within the medium of film, because film is profane in its guts in the sense that it's designed to do the opposite of that. It's supposed to seduce you. It's supposed to get your attention. It's supposed to hold your attention.
That's right.
But films like this do the opposite of that. They slow way down. There are way less frames in the film to begin with. They move at a very meditative pace.
That's correct.
The actors are told by the director to underact.
Yes.
and not be very melodramatic.
Bresson he didn't want professional actors.
He didn't want professional
Same
actors.
Fellini did the same.
So these are almost aggressively anti-audience in a sense, and it's easy. So this is one of those features, you run into this from time to time, Ken, where you have somebody like, let's say, Ernest Hemingway.
Mhm.
Ernest Hemingway is a true artist, but he has a highly imitable style. It's very easy to parody Ernest Hemingway
Yes.
and make it look like he's just he's more like the emperor has no clothes, essentially. This style of film is easy to imitate, and it's easy to do it to not do it well. But if you have a true artist like Bresson, what the film can do is, amazingly, for a film to do this, it can slow you down,
Yes.
bring you to its meditative pace, and also bring you to a place of true spiritual introspection. I'm bringing this up. I'm not saying that you have to go out and watch these movies,
No.
guys. I'm bringing this up to show you that not only is cinema an art form, not only can films be serious works of art, they can bring you to a place of real spiritual breakthrough. And I don't think we're accustomed in evangelical circles to think of films in these terms.
No, I don't think so either. And I think it's to our loss. I think the church is always looking for overtly Christian themes and motifs, and they create second-rate work, and it's known as so. So the idea of creating greatness and just emulating that greatness, and you can see some. I can mention names of films that I've seen by various directors that I appeal to, but every one of them is the richness of story and making it a universal thing. So you mentioned, for example, Ozu's film, Tokyo Story. It's about this couple, elderly couple, and the pathos and the sadness and the diminishment of their lives and the disconnection from it breaks your heart when you see a film like that. But will a person see that? I don't know, because there's a kind of a trained eye that you have to be willing to try a different experience instead of just mere entertainment. Now you're looking at something for illumination, for imagination, for seeing yourself in a new world and in a new way, and understanding the way the world can be in a different way that you might have expected to see. So certain films that speak to me, to Karen and me, will not be generally popular, but if a person gave them a try, so I just try one out.
Yeah, not all the time.
Maybe, for example, the Seventh Seal, Bergman's film, because there's something compelling about that, even in spite of just let it go and just enjoy the thing. Take the ride with it, or slow down and force yourself to see it. I think expanding our palate is an important thing to do. Yeah.
And also, I think of W.H. Auden had a really wise saying when it came to great literature.
Yeah.
He basically said, look, you wouldn't eat a 7-course French meal every single day. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, when you visit he was talking about literary masterpieces, but this really applies to any masterpiece, I think, period. He said those are for those high holidays of the spirit.
Yes, high holidays.
We're not accustomed to thinking of movies in these terms, but we're suggesting you should. So there are times where if you are open to these films, on occasion, not all the time, you can find yourself not only challenged, but you'll find your horizons expanded amazingly. Some of these films really can do that. They have that capacity, but it's just recognizing that those possibilities are written into the medium itself. We can use a similar example in the world of books. There's nothing wrong. Everybody always picks on Tom Clancy. His name is the one that always comes to mind at first, but there is obviously a world of difference between reading a Tom Clancy novel, which is fine, by the way, and reading The Tempest by Shakespeare, or reading Paradise Lost, or, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, The Turn of the Screw, you name it. But in a similar way, you can do this with films too. Is there anything wrong with watching a movie for entertainment, a movie that's fun? No, of course not. But it's also good occasionally to read the Shakespeare, so to speak, and to watch the film that can and will expand your horizons. And here's the other thing about masterpieces. Often it's the case that we don't like them at first.
It's an acquired taste, and so it would be true with anything. With Karen's the one who turned me on more into opera, and so that's more of an acquired taste. But once you begin to see things, poetry. Great poetry
Oh,
can be
yes.
for many. You may intuitively like it, but it's an acquired taste largely to apprehend how does a poem mean? I like that. That's the name of
Mm-hmm.
one of Karen's books that she had. How does a poem mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the whole idea of a whole realm of imagination and realms of mystery and awe and sense of transcendence, the sense of the numinous that great films also poetically capture. So I have a list of things that I'm having you see, and you've given me a list of films for me to. You mentioned Schrader, and I've made me think of First Reformed,
Yes.
which I thought was a very fascinating film, and Lost Highway, powerful films
Mm-hmm.
on Ordette, Spirit of the Beehive, and so forth. So you've opened me up to a whole realm of things I had overlooked, and now I'm getting you into. So we talked about the Seven Samurai, Akira Kurosawa's. It may be, the more I learn about that film, the better it gets. It may be the greatest film I've ever known
I
for
think you
various
could make
reasons.
a case that
Yeah.
it's certainly one of the greatest
Beyond
films ever made.
imagination. Yeah.
Yeah, you might be able to
Yeah.
go to get even more bold than that. Yeah, the
Right.
funny thing about both of our lists is mine tends to be a little bit more modern,
Yeah.
a little bit more. I like scary stories, so little horror focused. Ken's tends to be more on the early, really kind of the golden years of
The
cinema,
golden
you
years
might
of
say.
cinema. So I'll give you a list of some of the ones I've that Cameron and I are going to be discussing. So we just we talked about Amarcord, Fellini's I Remember, but in Casablanca before that. But Metropolis, Fritz Lang's film. Shadow of a Doubt will be our next one with Alfred Hitchcock, and it's so compelling and it's so remarkable in many ways. La Belle, La Bête, Beauty and the Beast by Jean Cocteau. Enchanted April, Babette's Feast, Rashomon Kurosawa film, of course. Tender Mercies, Bruce Beresford's wonderful, touching film with. It's just an actual Robert Duvall is a marvel in that, and so it's about simplicity. Why has God been so good to me? Why did He give me a second chance? So certain films capture us, some with joy, some with terrible pain. Wild Strawberries, Ingmar Bergman, Fitzcarraldo, Werner Herzog. But then they go to Double Indemnity, Billy Wilder, or someone, again, A Man for All Seasons. It's a film I've taught. I love North by Northwest, and so I like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's the Odysseus
Yep.
thing. So each of these has fun, and each of these has so many possibilities, but not to be just limited, I think, by just what happens to be out there right now.
Right. Yeah, and I've been a big proponent of not joining the relevance rat race.
Relevance Rat Race, good name.
Part of my hope for this episode, and then as we continue to talk about movies, is just to get the idea out there to you, to entertain the thought that film can be a serious work of art, and secondly, that it can be a place of real spiritual breakthrough. Again, I think in many of particularly in evangelical circles, we're predisposed to think of films less seriously. And I'm seeing some signs of change there. I'm hoping that change continues and we begin to not just read films, so to speak, but watch them and let them wash over you, and be open to films that are maybe more challenging, films that are out of your comfort zone.
If you go to reflections.org and just type in 4 letters, FILM, I just came up with a whole array of topics here. One of them is how to read a film, and I forgot about this. This is a pretty substantial piece of work where it's a long article that I've got here, and identifying the inciting incidents, and so identify the crisis and identify the climax. So it's a way of looking at film in a more analytical way, but we're just getting, what is the nature of story? What's the nature of conflict and the resolution of conflict and so forth, and a list of favorite films and so forth. So films are a huge, huge part, because being such a part of our culture, it's part of our ethos. But I think we need to stretch ourselves to become aware of the greatest stuff ever being. Just as you say, there are classics that will always reward revisitation, because if it's that good, you are a different person every time you read it, and you see a new thing in it. It exegetes you.
Exactly.
You see, whereas certain films, they're fine to see, and I enjoy seeing them, and they're fun and so forth, but I wouldn't make a diet of them, because it's like eating junk food, as you say. So there's some nice places for one thing, but having a mixed thing, but trying new things and new languages, new places. Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky's great film, is another example that just popped into my mind. But there are just so many films, like, as I say, Wild Strawberries, Bergman, that are so captivating. I wept when I saw Nights of Cabiria. It's about this prostitute, and Giulietta Messina is Fellini's wife. And by the end of the film is such she basically ends on a note of hope, but it's a all is lost. And yet at the same time, she has this sense of, let me laugh, let me have joy in life. So
Transcendent hope.
it's a transcendent hope, and it's very compelling. So sometimes you're just overwhelmed by the beauty of a thing that just captivates it in a way that, so I think we can train ourselves to see, just as we can see great film and great plays, great literature,
Great film and great
poetry.
plays usually require you to slow down.
You have to slow down.
Yeah.
Into Deep Silence was a film that I saw some years
Yes.
ago. And I'm probably one of the few people on the planet who've seen it twice.
Yes.
It's a long movie.
I love that film. And I think A.O. Scott, New York Times critic, had my favorite word on it when he said, I don't know if I would say it's so much the best film of the year as I would say it's the antidote to all the other films.
That's a good way to put it. You see.
Yeah.
And there are three iconic, there's like little triptychs. There's iconic images of faces of the monks.
Oh, it's
he uses it three times in the film.
very disarming. Yes.
Disarming. And you see in those faces the depth of the contemplative life, and it is compelling. It's palpable. So the film drives you nuts at the beginning because you're just watching this thing drop, drip, 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 drip. And what is going on? So you're forced to slow down. And if you can bear that pain, but it will reveal more about us than it does about the world.
It does. I mean, most spiritual exercises and contemplative exercises, by the way, are going to do the very same thing
Precisely
that
so.
films like that are doing. They're going to try to slow you down, and you are going to learn just how frantic and restless your own heart is in the process.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a kind of again, as with nature, though, going into a place and come away with me to a quiet place, a secluded place. There's something about the slowing down that nature would force you to do and being aware of that. And just the imagery of walking, always walking, and with his disciples and so forth, and the stories that he would tell. Then let me tell you a story in these places and so forth. And so, a great film is almost like bringing us around the campfire and around where the greatest stories were told at the under fire.
Yes.
In the air, by water, and next to the earth, the four elements, and great stories were shared. Quoted by memory by these wonderful, basically minstrels, as it were, of the spirit. And going back to Homer, and let me tell you this story about. So it goes back to these great stories that tell me a story, and that's really what we're looking for.
And let me tell you what you can't do very well in order for this to happen. What you've just described is so beautiful and so powerful. But the scatterbrained way we go about watching movies with our phone in our hands while we're scrolling, while we're cleaning up the house or ironing, these kinds of films that Ken and I are talking about will not really permit that.
No, they demand attention. They demand a price. If you're going to learn from that sage, you need to follow the rules of the house.
You have to submit.
You have to submit to the rules. And so the rules of the game, another great film. But the idea of seeing how there are certain ordered ways of entering, and there's traditions. But to do that, we know this is where the best meals take place, the best food, the best environment, table fellowship. That motif of table fellowship being the whole idea of hospitality and the Eucharistic love feasts, and that whole idea of staying around the table and chatting and connecting together with food and the friendship and the fellowship that produces. It's a universal desire.
As we bring this to a close, Ken, I'm going to do something bold that I wasn't planning on doing, because I'm hesitant to recommend too much, because I think people often coast on other people's choices and don't develop their own taste. But on a podcast like this, we're mentioning a lot of films that I think will be somewhat foreign to many of our listeners. So I think I'd like to end with a recommendation. If you want to if you want to dip your toe into this kind of cinema, I actually think, and this might sound like a tall order initially, but I think Seven Samurai might be your place to
That
begin.
would be a wonderful place to begin.
It's a long film, but it's tremendously fun to watch as well. There's a reason it's so beloved. And also, by the way, it's a cinematic cornerstone of so many newer films as well. You'll see The Magnificent Seven, by the
Sure.
way, is a
Peckinpah, yeah.
flagrant, yeah.
Flagrant.
I don't know if
yeah.
I mean, it's almost a ripoff.
It
but
is, yeah.
so many modern Westerns have drawn from Seven Samurai. Many siege movies, many action films are based on the architecture of this film. But Seven Samurai also has it has everything in it. It's got action, it's got amazing characters, and it's an amazing story, but it also has built into it that same contemplative kind of ethos as well. It takes its sweet time bringing you through this entire village, mapping all the terrain of the battle, the epic battle that will come. So I think it's immensely enjoyable, but I think it also will have enough challenging elements in it to push you a little bit too. I would say that's a great place to begin.
I think that would be a fine place to begin. Yeah. Another one comes to mind, very accessible, Enchanted April, because it's about how the magic of seeing beauty and it being immersed in beauty can actually create an environment of shalom that can actually bring a unity out of disharmony. Beautiful thing, Babette's Feast, or there's so many things we could see. One film I would recommend strongly by Robert Duvall, not well known, Tender Mercies. It's a charming film. It came out in 1983, Bruce Beresford's film. But it's a charming film about the simplicity, and that's what I think one should look for. It doesn't have to be dramatic in some ways, but it is. It's intense and powerful and rips the heart. And if we just go with that, there's a simplicity and a beauty that a film like that can captivate. I think it's a very beautiful thing. So I have so many films I would recommend for various reasons, of course. Yeah.
So there you have it. Tender Mercies, Seven Samurai. Those might be two good places to start.
Places to start. If you want a nice, maybe Hitchcockian film, the two I would suggest is Shadow of a Doubt, North by Northwest. And Stranger, I'll give three. Strangers on a Train. You can't beat those. You want narrative and drama and power. These are where it came from. And this is really, everything's kind of an imitation and modification of themes, but these have the motifs that are brilliant. So expose yourself to something a little bit broader than just the present time, not only in terms of time, language, and culture, just trying other things can be very powerful.
This has been fun, Ken. I'm really looking forward to diving into some of the specific films as we continue this discussion. But thanks for listening in.
Enjoyable time.